Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me once again for some nightly musing on the nature of storytelling. This is part 2 of my critique of the Star Wars sequel trilogy. In the first video, I examined each of the movies individually to see how they fail as individual stories. This time around, I will be examining how they all fail together as a single story. In other words, how they fail as a trilogy. I gave the introduction to the series in the first video, so let's get right into it. Section 1. What the hell is going on? Now, I found for the most part that your average film goer can enjoy these movies relatively well, if you block from your brain the notion that, oh wait, these were supposed to go together. This is perhaps another reason for why The Force Awakens was initially so well received, and it made writing the first part of the script a little difficult, I will admit. There are a lot of problems with each of the movies in the trilogy, but most of the problems, or at least most of the obvious ones, are problems with them as a trilogy. Not a single one of these movies work with the other two, and in fact the mere existence of the events in the other two movies make each one worse. I don't think I need to say that this is the exact opposite of how an actual trilogy is supposed to function. In a good trilogy, you'll have the main characters and concepts get introduced in the first movie, you'll see them grow and develop in the second one, and finally, the relationship they've built and the concepts they've grown to understand will be put to the final test and a resolution will be reached. This was not what happened in the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Characters and concepts get introduced in The Force Awakens, get dropped or subverted in The Last Jedi, then you have a group of people and droids who have had barely any on-screen time together, with the exception of Finn and Rey in The Force Awakens, of course, and they go off to resolve the trilogy by fighting a big baddie who was introduced, within the context of this trilogy at least, in the final movie. And this leads me to my first point. Nothing in this trilogy makes any sense. In the last video, I discussed how I made a summary, so to say, of the movie's plots. That wasn't a joke. I actually did that, and I ended up stopping because of the fact that the movies were reporting too much conflicting information for me to even make a Word document of it make sense. Now, I know a lot of people don't care about world building, since they don't think it affects the story very much, and you will probably have an easier time suspending your disbelief when it comes to world building. But I think that this is a detrimental tendency in writing, especially in an already established franchise. Let's look specifically at how the world building is as it concerns the trilogy. Is it bad? Yes. Why is that important? Well, let's first establish exactly what the world building is in the first place. The first movie tells us that there is a new republic which has been established after the fall of the old empire. Similarly, the First Order has arisen out of the ashes of the empire, and there is a new paramilitary group called the Resistance, which is allied to the Republic. Now, this isn't a terrible start for a setup, and there are many things that you can do with these concepts which make them interesting. Although the existence of a paramilitary group allied to the Republic is something which needs a little bit of an explanation. From what we're shown, the Resistance seems to be somewhere around as powerful as the strength of the Rebellion during the Empire Strikes Back, possibly weaker. The First Order, for the most part, seems to be limited to Starkiller Base as well as several Star Destroyers in The Force Awakens. The movie also introduces Snoke, who is said to have turned Kylo Ren away from the light and to the dark side of the Force, away from his parents, and away from Luke Skywalker. Snoke is shown to lead the First Order, though who exactly he is and where he comes from, and to what extent he is supplying the First Order with their resources, is unknown. Finally, we are introduced to a mysterious group called the Knights of Ren through dialogue, as well as through one of the visions that Rey is given by Anakin's lightsaber. Now, concerning the New Republic, we were given little to no information in The Force Awakens, and we were not given any information throughout the rest of the trilogy. The Republic only seems to function as an abstract concept, which acts as the motivation for many of our characters, despite the fact that its presence in the actual narrative is mostly absent.
We are the spark that will light the fire that will restore the Republic.
It works only as a representation of good government for the audience and characters, despite the fact that we have no idea what life in the restored Republic was like, and therefore are unable to judge whether or not the Republic actually represents good government or not. This severely affects the ability of the Republic to act as a goal with which the audience can understand and sympathize. One might respond to this by saying that this was the case in the original trilogy as well, but that's because the rebels in the original trilogy weren't fighting to restore the Republic. They were fighting for freedom from tyranny, i.e., they were fighting to destroy the Empire. That the rebels would go on to create a better government after the fall of the Empire was assumed, but unless I've missed major dialogue in the original trilogy, it wasn't the restoration of anything which drove our characters. It was the destruction and overcoming of a very concrete threat, namely the Empire. The problem is that in the sequel trilogy the narrative is switched around, so that the primary motivation of the Resistance is to protect the restored Republic, and then to restore the public again once it gets destroyed, with the destruction of the First Order simply being the necessary means by which to accomplish this primary goal. To be sure, this isn't of itself a problem. In fact, the writers could have used this to add an interesting dynamic to the story, so that while in the original trilogy we were only fighting to destroy the Empire, in this trilogy we are fighting to restore something worth fighting for. But whereas in the original trilogy we saw the evil of the Empire, and therefore had a concrete reason to hate it, in this trilogy we are not shown the goodness of the Republic, and therefore have no reason to actually hope for its restoration. And this is why the Republic simply doesn't work in the sequel trilogy. It is there to be mentioned, blown up, and then ignored for the purposes of the story, except again as a motivation for the main characters. The Republic as a concrete entity has about half the narrative weight of Alderaan in the original movie, in that both act as the first target of the big superweapon of the antagonist, which demonstrates the superweapon's power. But whereas in the original movie Alderaan had meaning to Leia, in that we knew it was her home planet to which she had a very personal connection, and thus it had meaning to us since she was a point-of-view character, here we don't even know what these planets are, to the point that some people legitimately thought that the planet we saw in this scene was Coruscant, which is as logical a deduction as any, seeing how little information we've been given. This can be fine, but it also adds to the stockpile of questions which have already been introduced by The Force Awakens. But I'll get to those later. The point here is that if the first Starkiller attack was indeed originally meant to be the death scene of the Republic, then The Force Awakens destroyed was supposed to be one of the primary motivations of the characters, without giving us reason to think it is important in the first place. When we arrive at The Last Jedi, we find that the entire Republic is apparently gone. So canonically at least, the first Starkiller attack was indeed the Republic's death scene, with the Resistance being the only thing left to oppose the First Order. Holdo says that the people on these 3 ships are all that's left of the Resistance, and that they will light the fire which will restore the Republic. We also learn from Rey that the First Order has apparently enough Star Destroyers to take control of all the major systems within weeks. Snoke is killed before we get any information about his backstory, which we only learn in The Rise of Skywalker, where Kylo Ren sees a large cloning tube filled with Snokes. How he acted in relation to Palpatine is never explored or explained, so I won't comment on it or make any hasty judgments. But apparently this does mean that Snoke really did appear out of nowhere and lead the First Order all of a sudden with no one asking any questions. None of Leia's allies arrive at the Battle of Crate because, I guess the galaxy has lost all of its hope. But then again, the story of Luke Skywalker facing down the entire First Order inspires hope in everyone again. Then the whole galaxy arrives at the Battle on Exegol because Lando calls them. Now, I understand why being called by Lando Calrissian, one of the heroes of the First Rebellion, can be a very exciting prospect. What I can't understand is why one would reject a call by Leia Organa, and then accept a call by Lando Calrissian. And they show up pretty quickly too. Like, all of them were ready to go immediately upon being called, as I don't see how else they could have gotten there within about an hour. Finally, the concept of a Force dyad is introduced in the final movie. And the concept is never really explained except in that it allows Palpatine to get his powers back. Or was this part of the whole darkness rises and light to meet it thing? I have no idea. And this leads me back to my first point. What the hell is going on? So many basic aspects of what is going on are left unanswered, and in fact, made more confusing by the end of the trilogy. So instead, let's just focus on the first 2 movies which aren't as pathologically insane. Here are a few questions which I think majorly contribute to our understanding of the stakes. Did the Republic have a military? Does anyone other than the First Order and the Resistance have a military? If so, why don't they ever show up or help the Resistance in any way, shape, or form until Exegol? If no one has a military, why not? Does the Republic not think it would be a good idea to create a military given the past 100 years of this saga? Are they incapable of creating a military? Were these planets destroyed right here, a little bit of the Republic, most of it, or all of it? Is it just the administrative portion of the Republic, or was the Republic the smallest galactic nation in history? True, Hux does say in his Hitler speech, "This day is the end of the Republic," but since we are given no context as to what the Republic is in the first place, I suppose we are meant to assume that the Republic consisted solely of 5 planets? It could just be the administrative portion of the Republic, but it also could not. We are given no indication one way or the other, so it's all just guesswork at this point. Now, for the past 2 years, I've held the very strong opinion that the most detrimental line in the entire sequel trilogy is Rey's line that the First Order will take control of all the major systems within weeks. It makes the First Order come off as comically powerful, despite the fact that they are meant to be a remnant of the Empire, not the Empire itself. And it forces me to ask the question of why the First Order spent time, effort, and resources building Starkiller Base, when they obviously had both the manpower and the equipment to take over the entire galaxy within a short amount of time. After all, Rey's line is after the destruction of Starkiller Base, so you can't use the fact that people are scared of Starkiller Base as an explanation. And if the rest of the galaxy doesn't know that Starkiller Base has been destroyed, then all you would have needed to do was add those words to Rey's line. At best, this is a case of extremely poor writing, an attempt to make the bad guys seem extremely threatening. But at worst, this is a world-building hole. Or a world hole, I guess, as opposed to a plot hole. As I see it, the only in-world reason for the First Order to construct Starkiller Base would have been that there was a massive enough fleet to destroy the entire First Order which the Republic had at their disposal. And if this is the case, it would have meant that the First Order knew that most or all of the Republic's military was contained on, and would continue to be contained on a small group of planets which could be disposed of by a single blast of their massive superweapon that was under construction. If that actually is the case, that seems like an incredible long shot, and it also doesn't really make a lot of sense. That, in turn, creates a lot more questions about the relative strength of the First Order. But I won't belabor the point. I'm sure you get it by now. These are not all the world-building questions which are introduced by these movies. I could have delved much deeper, but I believe that these are the most pertinent questions which allow us to understand what even is the status quo. Furthermore, I want to be clear that these are not necessarily plot holes. Well, okay, not all of them are plot holes. Many of them are simply reasonable things to ask, and they could have had perfectly well-constructed and reasonable answers. And I also feel I need to reiterate that the problem here is not that these questions about the state of the galaxy can be asked. The problem here is that they are both reasonable and relevant things to ask, since they directly affect the stakes of the story, our understanding of what is and is not possible, as well as assist our understanding of how things got to the point where they were after the original trilogy. Yet all of them go completely unanswered. Now, why is this important? It is important because the world building encompasses every aspect of your story. One might even say it's the very air which your characters breathe. And so anything and everything that is relevant to your story which has not already been set up by a previous story needs to be explained in some way, shape, or form. Because it is necessary to understand how the First Order arose, how powerful they are in comparison to the Republic, and also why they are so powerful. Why? Because their power is the very crux of the conflict in the trilogy, at least until the rise of Skywalker introduced Palpatine and Exegol. We should know, roughly, how strong the First Order is, because knowing this allows us to understand if they are being stupid, risky, or wise by building Starkiller Base and then relying on it to destroy the Republic and the Resistance. Furthermore, we need to know what the Republic is, how expansive it is, and what on earth they're doing about the First Order, because we were left to assume at the end of the original trilogy that our heroes had established a new Republic which should have at least encompassed the planets shown celebrating at the end of the Return of the Jedi. This does not mean that there are no Empire loyalists left, nor does it mean that the New Republic is instantly going to rule the entire galaxy like it had before the prequels. In fact, it doesn't really mean anything outside the fact that there are at least several major worlds, including the capital, which are happy at the collapse of the Empire. Which is why, if this trilogy is going to have a resurgent Empire retaking the galaxy, you need to show us what the relative strength of the factions is. Now, Someone is probably thinking to themselves, but this would be the most boring endeavor ever to explain all the complexities of galactic republicanism again, and I'm tired of that from the prequels. Plus, it would also take us out of the movie. But I fail to see how this would be the case. People often point to the prequels as instances where world building takes the forefront and all the politics talk is extremely boring. And you know what? I will grant you that. But what is often forgotten in this discussion is the fact that the originals also had a lot of world building. The title crawls, the boardroom scene in the original New Hope, the discussions between Leia and Tarkin, the cinematography and sets, and each of the events built a world that was both reasonable and believable. Well, for the most part. Of course, the originals were a blank slate, and so, you could reasonably give them the benefit of the doubt when new information was given, because the audience was like a family moving into a new city. It would obviously be unreasonable and stupid for this family to question every bit of new information they're given by the guide, because it didn't conform to their understanding of their old city. However, once the family becomes accustomed to the layout of the city, where everything is and how daily life in the city goes, if someone begins telling them different information, then they are far less likely to believe them. And they are being very reasonable for trusting the guide originally and distrusting the second person later. But all this excusing of the old trilogy is, well, not even really the point. 3 throwaway lines were all that was needed to explain most of the questions I have asked above. First, just simply keep the deleted scene from The Force Awakens, have some Randy mention how the First Order has retaken half the galaxy already, and then just have Hux or some First Order officer talk about how Snoke has been gradually bringing reinforcements into the First Order from the Outer Rim, or even some other obscure place after the destruction of Starkiller Base. Would these introduce even more problems? Possibly, but nothing like them was ever given in any of the movies, so I couldn't say one way or the other. Besides, the only point I'm trying to illustrate is that we don't need to have a scene where Leia and Poe start talking about galaxy statistics, or a scene where Finn describes the exact Dreadnought and Star Destroyer count of either the Republic or the First Order. They could have simply taken a page out of the original trilogy and had the bad guys talk about how well they're doing taking a firmer hold on the galaxy. They could have done any number of things, and I assure you that almost any of them would have allowed the viewing audience to have a reasonable understanding of what the stakes were as it related to the state of the galaxy. Or at least, better than how they did in the real trilogy. Alright, yes, so the world building is terrible. What is interesting about that is that the world building is not the largest problem with this trilogy. The lack of the continuities between the movies is a far greater problem when it comes to these stories functioning together. The Force Awakens sets up a number of new concepts and characters throughout its runtime, and it even sets up a couple of new Force powers which seem in many ways to be both natural and organic expansions of the Force. I've already detailed in the first part of this series how it abandons many of these setups before the audience has even left the theater. Nevertheless, there are real things that could be carried over into the second movie, specifically in the form of the questions that it introduces. But when we get into The Last Jedi, a trend is introduced into the trilogy. Who are Rey's parents? Nobody's. They aren't important. Who is Snoke? No explanation. He isn't important, it seems. Who are the Knights of Ren? They aren't even on screen, though now that we've seen them in The Rise of Skywalker, maybe that was a good thing.
You guys are so incompetent that I'm starting to think you didn't make it to The Last Jedi because you just got lost.
How did Maz Kanata get Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber? Not talked about or mentioned. What do any of these mean? No one cares. Why did R2-D2 wake up at just the right moment? Not brought up or mentioned. Neither is the map, actually. And a personal question of mine, why did Leia hug Rey instead of Chewbacca after Han's death? Answer me, JJ. To be clear, I am not yet talking about subverting expectations, though that is a related problem, and my thoughts on that are forthcoming. The specific problem here is not simply that these things are subversions, or even that they are bad subversions. The problem is, well, they are simply setups that do not get paid off. In storytelling, there's a general rule called Chekhov's gun, which says that every single line of dialogue, everything that you show, everything that you narrate, in fact, simply everything that has to do with your writing, should be useful to the story in some way, shape, or form. If you show a gun in Act 1, then you need to have the gun be fired in Act 2. This is an essential rule because if you do not follow it, you will be either confusing your audience or delivering promises which you will not be fulfilling. And this is what we have in these movies. To the point where I could have very easily made a video series entitled The Broken Promises of the Star Wars Sequel Trilogy. A few weeks ago, Literature Devil made a video about Abrams' mystery box and why it ultimately doesn't work, and I think that's especially relevant to the discussion here. We were given narrative promises by The Force Awakens that things like Rey's parents were important to her story, that Snoke was important, and The Last Jedi did not deliver on the promises set up by the previous film. This is the fault of The Last Jedi, both because it is a sequel to The Force Awakens, and therefore has the duty to fulfill the promises its predecessor gave, and the fact that The Last Jedi itself tells us a number of times that at least some of these questions are important. And this is where the topic of subverting expectations comes in. Now, I know everyone has made fun of the notion of subverting expectations for the past several years, but, well, they're wrong and I'm right, and here's why. Subverting expectations is actually a very powerful and very satisfying narrative tool across all genres. And I would argue that it is perhaps the greatest crime of movies like The Last Jedi and shows like Game of Thrones, that they have discredited this concept in the eyes of many people. Since Subversion is actually a very effective tool for crafting things like memorable moments, maintaining tension, or, yes, even offering social commentary. All a Subversion entails is that the audience does not expect something to happen within a story, or they specifically expect something to not happen, or at least not happen in that way, that is, and then it does. A subversion can be anything you want it to be, since the number of things your audience did not expect to happen is infinitely larger than what your audience expected to happen. And you can even find a number of different cases of this throughout the history of storytelling. To give a few modern examples, because those are the easiest to explain why they're subversions, you have stories like The Hobbit, where the audience expects that Bilbo will slay the dragon, but then a random character named Bard does instead. You have the first season of Game of Thrones, where the audience expects that Ned Stark will triumph in the end, but then he dies at the end of the first book and season. And you even have Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, and one of the most famous instances of subversion in history.
No, I am your father.
For my favorite older example, I can give you Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but that's a story for a different time. Just know that that entire book is a subversion of expectations. It's awesome. Each of these subvert expectations in a very different way. In the case of The Hobbit, we expect Bilbo to slay the dragon because we've seen him get stronger and braver throughout the story. Moreover, The Hobbit is a fantasy story. And in fantasy, we expect a test of bravery to take the form of slaying a beast based on how fairy tales usually work. The subversion is very effective. Why? Because it plays on an element that the story has been building up throughout the entire narrative. Bilbo's value to the group is not found in his strength and skill as a warrior. Bilbo was not hired as a dragon slayer, even under false pretenses. He was hired as a burglar, and his growth throughout the story was as a man who could effectively sneak around. Of course, he does have a sword, which he uses to kill the spiders and defend the dwarves, but his prominent tool, his most prominent one, and the one he uses when he confronts Smaug, is not his sword. It's his magic ring. A ring which makes him invisible. Thus, the subversion of the audience's expectation further accentuates the message of the story and delivers a far more satisfying resolution to Bilbo's character arc than if he actually did slay Smaug. Something that was initially planned by Tolkien, but then scrapped for a far more satisfying conclusion. In the case of Game of Thrones, we expect that Ned Stark will live because he is both a point of view character, as well as the character who is portrayed as the most honorable and morally righteous. And in medieval fantasy stories, we generally expect that the hero of the story will persevere and win in the end no matter what the odds. The subversion works because of the fact that this is an unreasonable expectation, especially for someone who does the actions that Ned does. If another character were to do the chain of actions which end up getting Ned Stark captured and killed, then this would be exactly what would have happened to them. But main characters usually have plot armor. Not in this show, though. Ned Stark is then executed after he lies to the crowd to save his family, because now his honor and his integrity have been ruined by his own actions. This subversion is effective because it is the logical end of his character, the conclusion that it should have had, and to which the story pointed, as well as a symbolically satisfying end for his story arc. The reason our expectations were otherwise was because we had an unreasonable expectation, which was imposed on the story rather than drawn from it. There's a trend with all of these subversions. They are all properly set up so that the logical flow of the story leads them to this conclusion, or at the very least does not contradict previous setups, and they add something to the narrative, whether that be to a theme, a character, a plot, or all three. And herein lies the problem with the subversions in The Last Jedi. The expectations which are subverted are not there because unreasonable ideas of how the story should work were imposed upon the story. They were there because both The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens told us to expect them. Part of the problem here is actually Chekhov's gun. Is Snoke's sudden and uneventful death subversive? Well, yes. But his death at that point, with no explanation of who he was, does not add anything to the story, and instead it detracts from it, since Snoke was the only character in this story who could really help us understand the transition from the original trilogy to this one. Nevertheless, the far more egregious offender on this point is Rey's parentage. Is it a subversion of our expectations that Rey's parents are nobody, and then again that her father is Palpatine's son? Yes, it is a massive subversion. No one was expecting her parents to be nobodies, and really no one would have thought that she had a connection to Palpatine after The Last Jedi. Well, at least not before this. But this subversion wasn't surprising or shocking because it played on the unrealistic expectations of the audience. It was shocking because The Force Awakens teased Rey's parents as being important to her character, and despite this being at least partially resolved in The Force Awakens with Maz's line,
"Whomever you're waiting for on Jakku, they're never coming back."
The Last Jedi brought up the question even more, and made it seem like this was the essential hinge of her character. The audience's expectation that the character's parents will be important to the story did not come primarily from their irrational ideas about Star Wars, though that may have had an influence, I will admit. But they primarily came from the fact that the movies themselves showed, set up, subverted, and then confirmed it. But even then, the confirmation that yes, Rey's parents are actually important, well, it still wasn't very good, because there was no real setup for it. And this is probably one of the most problematic continuity errors in the entire trilogy. Palpatine's inclusion into the story as the ultimate villain of the franchise is overall poorly handled, but making him Rey's grandfather adds only one thing to the story: an explanation of why Rey is so good with the Force. But despite trying to appease the fans who demanded to know how Rey got her powers and were angry that her parents were nothing in The Last Jedi, the addition of Palpatine in the movie simply makes the trilogy worse. For instance, let's just ignore all the problems of introducing Palpatine in a trailer and then having his cinematic return happen in Fortnite. Instead, let's simply take The Rise of Skywalker on its word that Palpatine created Snoke, and that his ultimate plan was to inhabit Rey's body or something. Then when we look back at The Force Awakens, that means we are to take this line from Snoke:
If what you say about this girl is true, bring her to me, as a request that ultimately comes from Palpatine to bring his granddaughter to him. But wait, then we find out in The Last Jedi that Snoke just wanted the map from Luke from her, and then once he has it, he tells Kylo to kill her. Okay, well, I suppose they at least make this somewhat consistent with The Rise of Skywalker, since Palpatine also tells Kylo Ren to kill Rey, but doesn't this kind of interfere with his plan? Like, what if Kylo did kill Rey in either of these scenarios? Wouldn't that just ruin his plan? But then by the end of the movie, Palpatine reveals that he didn't want to kill Rey, he just wanted her here on Exegol with him. Okay, I'm sorry. Look, Palpy, I know that the concepts of kill and death are somewhat difficult for you to grasp given your state, but generally when you don't want someone dead and instead want them here, you don't go around requesting that people kill them. Also, don't give me any of that, well, the Force told him Kylo Ren wouldn't do it crap, because that's just an excuse for bad writing and I'm sick of it. That excuse is the main reason for why I've begun to dislike Star Wars, to the point that I don't even want to watch any of the new Star Wars shows or movies. which I know are gonna come out in the next several years. The Force is now just a nebulous plot device that excuses any and all lazy writing in the movies, and then spits in the face of every single fantasy writer who has spent hours trying to come up with a consistent magic system which is both compelling and meaningful to their story, and I'm just done with it. Besides, Palpatine should already know that the Force isn't reliable at this point, because the Force didn't tell him squat when it came to Vader killing him. So yeah, the explanation of, "the Force told him to do it," ain't gonna cut it this time. Okay, back on track. Where was I? Oh right, continuity. I could go on forever and ever 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 about all the continuity errors in these movies, because, again, I've only tried to cover some of them because I'm trying to be concise, let's say. As concise as an hour-long video can be. There are some that I considered doing, but I think what I've said in this section is sufficient. Instead, let's move on to an exciting topic. Who's to blame?